The air was thick with the scent of rain and rebellion as Elias revved his motorcycle. The engine's roar drowning out the jeers of the crowd. Julian stood across the street, his jaw tight, eyes blazing with a fire that could burn cities. In that moment, San Francisco's underground fight club felt like the center of the universe, and they were its warring gods. Elias Kane and Julian Torres had been rivals since they were kids scrapping in Oakland's back alleys. Both alphas, born leaders in a world that revered strength. They clashed over everything: territory, respect, even the right to breathe the same air. Their rivalry was legend, a saga whispered in dive bars and betting rings, where men wagered on who'd break first. Tonight, the stakes were higher than ever, a bare-knuckle fight to settle the score, with the winner claiming the city's most coveted underground title. Elias peeled off his jacket, revealing a physique carved from years of discipline and defiance. His green eyes locked onto Julian, who stood unflinching, his tailored blazer a stark contrast to the gritty warehouse around them. Julian's presence was magnetic, his every move deliberate, like a panther sizing up prey. The crowd parted as they stepped into the makeshift ring, the concrete floor stained with the ghosts of past battles. "You ready to lose, Torres?" Elias taunted, his voice low, a smirk curling his lips. Julian's laugh was sharp, cutting through the noise. "I don't lose to you, Kane. Never have. Never will." The bell rang, and the world blurred. Fists flew, each punch a testament to years of pin-up rage. Elias was raw power, his blows heavy, unrelenting. Julian was precision, dodging and striking with surgical accuracy. The crowd roared, but for the two alphas, it was just them, two forces of nature colliding, neither willing to yield. Sweat dripped from Elias's brow as he landed a solid hit to Julian's ribs. But Julian countered with a swift uppercut that split Elias's lip. Blood mixed with the dirt on the floor, and for a fleeting second, their eyes met. There was something beyond hate in that glance, something raw, unspoken, and dangerous. Elias shook it off, charging again, but his vision swam. His knees buckled, and the world tilted. He hit the ground hard, the crowd's cheers fading to a distant hum. Julian loomed above him, chest heaving, eyes wide with shock. "Elias," he said, his voice breaking through the haze. But Elias's world went black. When he woke, the sterile smell of antiseptic stung his nose. He was in a hospital bed, lines snaking into his arm. Julian sat in a chair beside him, his blazer gone, sleeves rolled up, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "You collapsed," Julian said, his voice rough. "Doctors said it's your heart. Rare condition. You're lucky to be alive." Elias tried to sit up, wincing. "Why the hell are you here, Torres? Come to gloat." Julian's jaw tightened. "I'm here because no one else was." The words hung heavy, a truth neither wanted to face. Elias was alone, always had been, save for the fights and the fleeting thrill of victory. Julian, for all his polished exterior, was no different. Two alphas, untouchable, yet untethered. Days later, Elias was discharged, but the prognosis was grim. His condition required constant monitoring, medication, and a life he couldn't afford. The underground world didn't offer health insurance, and his savings were a joke. He returned to his dingy apartment, the walls closing in, his pride a bitter pill to swallow. Then came the knock. Julian stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I paid your medical bills," he said flatly, "and I bought out your fight contract." Elias's blood ran cold. "You what? You're not fighting anymore. You can't." Julian stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You're mine now, Elias. My personal Omega. You work for me, or you're done." The words hit like a freight train. In their world, an Omega was a role of submission, a title no alpha would ever accept. It was a power play, a humiliation. Elias's fists clenched, his heart pounding against his fragile chest. "You think you can own me?" he growled. Julian didn't flinch. "I think I just saved your life." The room crackled with tension. Their history is stormed between them. Elias wanted to swing, to reclaim his pride, but his body betrayed him, a sharp pain shooting through his chest. He staggered, and Julian caught him, strong hands steadying him. For the first time, Elias saw something in Julian's eyes: concern, maybe even fear. "Get out," Elias whispered, but there was no venom in it. Julian didn't move. "You don't get it, do you? I'm not letting you die." That night, Elias lay awake, Julian's words echoing in his mind. He was an alpha. Damn it. He didn't bend, didn't break. But the truth was undeniable. He was vulnerable. And Julian had seen it. The man he'd spent years hating had just rewritten his fate. The next morning, Julian returned with a contract. It was simple. Elias would work as his personal assistant, handling logistics for Julian's underground empire. In return, Julian would cover his medical expenses and ensure he never fought again. It was a leash, but it was also a lifeline. Elias signed, his hand shaking with rage and resignation. "This doesn't make us friends," he spat. Julian's smile was faint, almost sad. "I don't need friends, Elias. I need you alive." And so began their uneasy alliance. Elias moved into Julian's sleek penthouse, a world away from his own rundown life. The city stretched out below them, a glittering prize they'd both fought for, now shared in a way neither expected. Elias handled schedules, negotiated deals, and kept Julian's operation running smoothly. But every glance, every brush of their hands, carried the weight of their past. One night, after a long day, Julian poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Elias. "Why'd you do it?" Elias asked, his voice raw. "Why save me?" Julian stared at the city skyline, his expression distant. "Because losing you would have broken me." The confession hung in the air, a fragile thread between them. Elias's heart raced, not from his condition, but from something deeper, something he'd buried under years of rivalry. He stepped closer, their breaths mingling, the line between hate and something else blurring. "I'm not your Omega," Elias said, but his voice was soft, uncertain. Julian turned, his eyes locking onto Elias's. "Then what are you?" The question lingered, unanswered, as the city hummed below, its pulse matching the unspoken rhythm of their hearts. The penthouse was a cage of glass and steel, its sleek surfaces reflecting Elias's unease. Every morning, he woke to the hum of San Francisco beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a city he'd once ruled now reduced to a backdrop for his new life. Julian's empire was a machine: fight clubs, betting rings, and shadowy deals, and Elias was its reluctant cog, organizing schedules and dodging the ghosts of his past. He hated it. Hated the way Julian's voice carried authority, the way his tailored suits hugged his frame, the way his presence filled every room. Most of all, he hated the way his own body betrayed him, his heart a ticking bomb that forced him to rely on the man he'd sworn to destroy. Yet, there was no denying Julian's efficiency. The medical bills were paid, the appointments scheduled, the medications delivered like clockwork. Elias was alive, but at what cost? Their days were a dance of tension. Elias worked from a desk in Julian's office, a space of dark wood and leather that screamed power. Julian was always close, leaning over to review a contract or brushing past to grab a file. Each touch was electric, a spark that Elias refused to acknowledge. He was an alpha, not some lovesick fool. But the way Julian's eyes lingered, dark and searching, made it hard to stay cold. One afternoon, a deal went south. A rival promoter, Marco Vega, tried to muscle in on Julian's territory, threatening to expose their operation to the cops. Elias watched Julian handle it, his voice calm but lethal, negotiating with the precision of a sniper. When Marco left, tail between his legs, Julian turned to Elias, his expression unreadable. "You handled that well," Elias said, the words grudging but honest. Julian raised an eyebrow. Surprised? No. Just impressed. Elias hated how the admission burned his throat. Julian stepped closer, his voice low. You're not just a hired hand. Elias, you're part of this now. The word stung, a reminder of his fall from grace. I'm your assistant. Elias snapped. Don't make it sound like we're partners. Julian's smile was sharp, almost predatory. Aren't we? That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He wandered the penthouse, the city lights casting shadows on the walls. Julian found him on the balcony. The cool night, air heavy with unspoken words. You hate this, don't you? Julian asked, his voice softer than Elias expected. Being your lapdog. Yeah, I do. Elias's tone was bitter, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Julian leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I didn't save you to cage you. I saved you because... He stopped, jaw tight, as if the words were too heavy to speak. Elias's heart pounded, his condition a cruel reminder of his limits. Because what? Julian. Say it. Julian turned, his eyes blazing. Because I've always seen you. Elias. Even when we were kids, fighting over scraps. You were never just a rival. You were everything. The confession hit like a punch, stealing Elias's breath. He wanted to lash out, to deny the heat rising in his chest. But his body had other plans. A sharp pain stabbed through him, and he gasped, clutching the railing. Julian was at his side in an instant, steadying him, his hands warm and sure. Breathe, Julian said, his voice a lifeline. I've got you. Elias wanted to push him away, to reclaim his pride, but the pain was too much. He leaned into Julian, their foreheads nearly touching, the world narrowing to the space between them. I'm not yours, Elias whispered, but the words felt hollow. Julian's grip tightened, his voice barely audible. You could be. The moment stretched, fragile and charged, until Elias pulled away, his chest heaving. He couldn't do this, not now, not ever. He was an alpha, not an omega, not a possession. But as he retreated to his room, Julian's words echoed, a seed planted in the cracks of his resolve. The next day, work resumed, but the air was different. Julian was more careful, his touches lingering, his glances heavier. Elias threw himself into the job, hoping to drown out the questions swirling in his mind. Who was Julian to him now? Savior? Captor? Something else entirely. A new challenge arose when a fighter from Julian's roster, a brash alpha named Lena Carter, started stirring trouble. She disrespected Elias publicly, calling him Julian's pet during a meeting. The room went silent, all eyes on Elias. His instinct was to swing, to prove he was still a force, but his body wouldn't allow it. Instead, he met her gaze, his voice cold. Say that again, and you'll regret it. Lena smirked, but Julian stepped in, his authority absolute. Lena, you're out of line. Apologize, or you're off the roster. She backed down, but the damage was done. Elias felt the stares, the whispers. He was no longer the feared alpha of the ring. He was Julian's shadow, and it burned. That night, Elias confronted Julian. I can't do this, he said, his voice raw. I'm not your damn charity case. Julian's eyes darkened. You think that's what this is? Charity. He stepped closer, his voice low and intense. I'm keeping you alive because I can't imagine this world without you. Elias's breath caught, the weight of Julian's words crashing over him. He wanted to fight, to run, but something held him there, tethered to the man he'd spent a lifetime hating. The line between rivalry and something deeper was blurring, and Elias wasn't sure he could stop it. The city never slept, and neither did Elias. Night after night, he lay in the guest room of Julian's penthouse, staring at the ceiling, his mind a battlefield. Julian's confession on the balcony haunted him. You were never just a rival. You were everything. The words were a grenade, and Elias was still reeling from the blast. By day, he buried himself in work, managing Julian's empire with a precision that surprised even himself. He negotiated with suppliers, vetted new fighters, and kept the books clean, all while ignoring the ache in his chest both from his condition and something less tangible. Julian was always there, a constant presence, his authority tempered by a quiet concern that Elias couldn't ignore. It was in the way Julian checked if he'd taken his meds, the way he left coffee on Elias's desk, the way his eyes softened when he thought Elias wasn't looking. But the underground world was restless. Rumors spread of a new player, a ruthless alpha named Victor Ruiz, who was buying up rival operations across the Bay Area. He had his sights on Julian's empire, and Elias could feel the storm coming. During a late-night strategy session, Julian laid out the threat. Victor was offering fighters double pay to defect, and some were listening. "We need to lock down loyalty," Elias said, scanning the roster. "Lena's already shaky. If she jumps ship, others will follow." Julian nodded, his expression grim. "We'll double our payouts for the next fight. Show them we're still the top dog." Elias hesitated, then spoke. "You're trusting me with this. Why?" Julian met his gaze, unflinching. "Because you're the only one I trust." The words landed like a blow, stirring something in Elias he wasn't ready to name. He pushed it down, focusing on the plan. They spent hours mapping out their next move, their voices low, the tension between them a living thing. When Julian's hand brushed Elias's while pointing at a map, neither pulled away. The contact lingered, a silent question neither dared to answer. The next day, they met with the fighters. Lena was there, her smirk sharper than ever. "Heard Victor's offering better odds," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why stick with a sinking ship?" Elias's blood boiled, but Julian stepped forward, his voice calm but deadly. "Victor's a vulture. He'll bleed you dry and leave you with nothing. Stick with us, and you'll have a future." The room murmured, some nodding, others uncertain. Elias watched Julian work the crowd, his charisma undeniable. For the first time, he saw Julian not as a rival, but as a leader flawed, fierce, and fiercely protective. It stirred something dangerous in Elias, a warmth he couldn't afford. That night, a crisis hit. One of Julian's warehouses was raided, equipment seized, and 2 fighters arrested. Victor's name was all over it. Julian was a storm, pacing the penthouse, his calm facade cracking. "He's testing us," he said, slamming a fist on the table. "He wants to see if we break." Elias stood, his own anger rising. "Then let's hit back. Hard." Julian turned, his eyes searching Elias's. "You sure you're up for this?" The question wasn't about his health, it was about his loyalty. Elias stepped closer, his voice steady. "I'm in. All the way." For a moment, they were just 2 men, stripped of titles and grudges, united against a common enemy. Julian nodded, a spark of relief in his eyes. They spent the night planning a counterstrike, targeting Victor's supply lines. It was dangerous, borderline illegal, but Elias felt alive for the first time in months. He wasn't just surviving, was fighting, even if it wasn't with his fists. As dawn broke, Julian handed Elias a burner phone. "For emergencies," he said. "You're my eyes out there." Elias took it, their fingers brushing. The touch was brief, but it burned. "Don't get soft on me, Torres," he said, forcing a grin. Julian's laugh was low, almost tender. "Never." The plan worked. They disrupted Victor's operation, reclaiming their edge. But the victory was fleeting. Lena defected, taking 3 fighters with her. The betrayal stung, but Elias felt it deeper. Had failed to see it coming. He confronted Julian, his voice raw. "I should have caught this. I let you down." Julian shook his head, stepping close. "You didn't. You're the only thing keeping me sane." The air was thick, the space between them shrinking. Elias's heart raced, his condition a cruel reminder of his limits. But it wasn't just his heart that ached. Julian's hand hovered near his arm, then dropped, as if afraid to cross a line. "Get some rest," Julian said, turning away. "We've got a war to win." Elias watched him go, the weight of their unspoken truths heavier than ever. He was an alpha, always would be. But with Julian, he felt something new, something that scared him more than any fight. The war with Victor escalated. A shadow game played in back alleys and whispered deals. Elias threw himself into it, his days a blur of strategy and surveillance. He tracked Victor's movements, pinpointed his weaknesses, and fed Julian every detail. It was a battlefield without fists, but Elias felt the old fire in his veins, the thrill of outsmarting an enemy. Yet, every victory came with a cost. His body was weakening, the strain of his condition undeniable. Julian noticed. He always did. One evening, as Elias pored over maps in the penthouse, Julian slid a bottle of water across the table. "You look like hell," he said bluntly. "When's the last time you slept?" Elias shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I'm fine." "You're not." Julian's voice was firm, but his eyes were soft, almost pleading. "You're pushing too hard. Elias, let me carry some of this." Elias's jaw tightened. "I'm not fragile." "No," Julian said, stepping closer. "You're human, and I need you to stay that way." The words cut deeper than Elias expected. He wanted to argue, to assert his strength, but the truth was undeniable. His hands shook as he reached for the water, and Julian's fingers brushed his, steadying him. The touch was gentle, a stark contrast to the chaos around them. For a moment, Elias let himself feel with warmth. The care, the thing he'd been running from. They were interrupted by a call. Victor had struck again, torching one of Julian's safe houses. The loss was minimal, but the message was clear: he was closing in. Julian's face was a mask of controlled rage as he gave orders to tighten security. Elias watched, torn between admiration and frustration. Julian was a force, but he was carrying too much alone. That night, Elias found Julian on the balcony, a glass of whiskey in hand, the city sprawling below. "We're losing ground," Julian said, his voice heavy. "Victor's got more resources than I thought." Elias leaned against the railing, the cool metal grounding him. "Then we get smarter. Hit him where he's weak." Julian turned, his eyes searching Elias's face. "You sound like you're enjoying this." "Maybe I am," Elias admitted. "Feels good to fight again, even if it's not with my fists." Julian's smile was faint, but it reached his eyes. "You're still a warrior, Elias. Always will be." The moment stretched, the air charged with something neither could name. Elias's heart raced, his condition a cruel reminder. But it wasn't just his heart that pounded. Julian stepped closer, their breaths mingling, the space between them electric. "Why do you keep doing this?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why keep me here?" Julian's gaze didn't waver. "Because I can't let you go." The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded. Elias wanted to push back, to cling to his pride, but his body had other plans. A sharp pain shot through his chest, and he gasped, clutching the railing. Julian was there in an instant, his arms around Elias, steadying him. "Breathe," he said, his voice a lifeline. "I've got you." Elias leaned into him, the world narrowing to the warmth of Julian's embrace. For the first time, he didn't fight it. He let himself feel the strength, the care, the unspoken promise. When the pain subsided, he pulled back, but not far. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the world was just them. The next day, they got a break. Elias's surveillance paid off a tip about Victor's next move, a shipment of cash and weapons. They planned a heist, a risky play to cripple Victor's operation. Elias insisted on going, despite Julian's protests. "I'm not sitting this out," he said, his voice firm. "I need this." Julian relented, but his worry was palpable. The night of the heist was tense, the air thick with fog as they moved through Oakland's docks. Elias's heart pounded, not just from the danger, but from Julian's presence beside him. They worked in sync, their old rivalry replaced by a seamless partnership. The heist was a success. But as they fled, a gunshot rang out, grazing Elias's arm. Julian dragged him to safety, his hands shaking as he checked the wound. "You're an idiot," he snapped, but his voice was thick with fear. "You could have died." Elias grinned, adrenaline coursing through him. "But I didn't." Julian's eyes blazed, a mix of anger and something deeper. He pulled Elias close, their faces inches apart. "Don't make me lose you," he said, his voice breaking. The moment was cut short by sirens, forcing them to run. But as they hid in an alley, catching their breath, Elias felt the shift. The line between them was gone, replaced by something stronger, something neither could deny. The graze on Elias's arm was shallow, but Julian treated it like a mortal wound. Back at the penthouse, he cleaned and bandaged it with a focus that bordered on obsession, his hands steady but his eyes betraying a storm. Elias watched him, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. "I'm fine," Elias said, breaking the tension. "Stop fussing." Julian didn't look up. "You're not fine. You're reckless." Elias laughed. "The sound rough," says the guy who runs an underground empire. Julian's hand stilled, his gaze meeting Elias's. "I run it to keep things stable. You're out here trying to prove you're still invincible." The words hit hard, a truth Elias couldn't dodge. He wasn't invincible, not anymore. His condition was a constant reminder, a chain he couldn't break. But Julian's care, his quiet intensity, was a different kind of chain, one Elias wasn't sure he wanted to escape. The war with Victor raged on, each move a chess play in a game with no rules. Elias and Julian worked tirelessly, their partnership growing stronger, their trust deeper. But the tension between them was a live wire, sparking with every glance, every touch. Elias felt it most at night, when the city's hum was the only sound, and Julian's presence was a pull he couldn't resist. One evening, after a long day, Julian suggested they take a break. He drove them to a quiet overlook above the city, the Golden Gate Bridge glowing in the distance. They sat on the hood of Julian's car, the night air cool, the silence companionable. "You ever think about getting out?" Elias asked, his voice low. "Leaving all this behind?" Julian stared at the bridge, his expression distant. "Sometimes. But this life, it's who I am." Elias shook his head. "It's what you do, not who you are." Julian turned, his eyes searching. "And who are you, Elias? The fighter? The alpha? Or something else?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Elias wanted to answer, to define himself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he leaned closer, their shoulders brushing. "I'm figuring it out," he said finally. Julian's smile was soft, almost vulnerable. "Me too." The moment was shattered by a call. Victor had retaliated, hitting one of Julian's key allies. The news pulled them back to the war, but the drive home was different. Julian's hand rested on the gearshift, inches from Elias's, and neither moved to break the connection. The next day, they learned Victor was planning a major movie, a public fight to draw Julian out. It was a trap, but they had no choice. Elias insisted on being there, despite Julian's protests. "I'm not letting you face this alone," he said, his voice firm. Julian's eyes softened, but his voice was steel. "If you go, you stay back. No heroics." Elias nodded, but his mind was racing. He wasn't just fighting for Julian's empire, he was fighting for Julian. The realization was a jolt, a truth he couldn't unsee. He was falling, hard, for the man he'd once sworn to destroy. The night of the fight was electric, the underground arena packed with a restless crowd. Julian stood tall, his presence commanding, but Elias saw the strain in his eyes. Victor was there, a hulking figure with a cruel smile, his fighters circling like wolves. Elias stayed in the shadows, his heart pounding, his instincts screaming to jump in. When the fight began, it was brutal. Julian's best fighter held his own, but Victor's men played dirty, and the crowd sensed blood. Elias's hands clenched, his body itching to act. But he stayed put, honoring Julian's orders. Then Victor made his moviest signal to his men, and chaos erupted. Fists flew, knives flashed, and the arena became a battlefield. Elias saw Julian in the fray, fighting off two men at once. Without thinking, he dove in, his body moving on instinct. Pain shot through his chest, but he ignored it, tackling one of Julian's attackers. They hit the ground hard, and Elias landed a solid punch before Julian pulled him back. "What the hell are you doing?" Julian shouted, his eyes wild. "Saving your ass." Elias shot back, breathless. The fight ended with Victor's men retreating, but the cost was high. Several fighters were injured, and Julian's operation was exposed. Back at the penthouse, Julian was a storm, pacing, his voice sharp. "You could have died out there, Elias. You promised me." Elias stood his ground, his own anger rising. "I'm not your damn Omega, Julian. I'm your equal." Julian froze, his eyes blazing. "You think I don't know that? I'm trying to keep you alive because He stopped." His voice breaking. Elias stepped closer, his heart racing. "Because what?" Julian's gaze locked onto his, raw and unguarded. "Because I love you." The words were a thunderclap, shattering the walls between them. Elias's breath caught, his world tilting. He wanted to fight it, to cling to his pride. But the truth was undeniable. He loved Julian too. Julian's confession hung in the air, a truth too raw to touch. Elias stood frozen, his heart pounding, torn between the fire of his pride and the pull of something deeper. The penthouse was silent, the city's glow a distant hum, as if the world itself held its breath. "I don't need your love," Elias said finally, his voice rough, but the words lacked conviction. He turned away, his chest tight not from his condition, but from the weight of Julian's gaze. Julian stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "Maybe not, but I'm giving it anyway." Elias wanted to run, to hide from the vulnerability clawing at him. But there was nowhere to go. Julian was everywhere, his scent, his presence, his damn stubborn care. Elias's hands clenched, his alpha instincts screaming to reclaim control. But his heart had other plans. He turned, their eyes locking, and for the first time, he didn't look away. The next day, they threw themselves back into the war with Victor. But everything felt different. Julian's touches lingered, a hand on Elias's shoulder, a brush of fingers when passing a file. Elias felt each one like a spark, igniting something he couldn't name. They were partners now, not just in strategy, but in something unspoken, something that scared Elias more than any fight. Victor's next move was bold, a public challenge, a fight to end all fights, with the winner taking control of the Bay Area's underground. Julian had no choice but to accept, but Elias saw the toll it was taking. Julian's eyes were shadowed, his shoulders tense, the weight of his empire crushing him. Elias wanted to ease it, to carry some of that burden, but his own body was a traitor, his strength fading with each passing day. They planned meticulously, knowing Victor would cheat. Elias took charge of security, ensuring their fighters were protected, but his condition made every step a gamble. During a late-night meeting, he felt the familiar stab in his chest, sharper than before. He hit it, but Julian's eyes missed nothing. "You're not okay," Julian said, pulling him aside. "Don't lie to me." Elias forced a grin. "Just a bad day. I've got this." Julian's jaw tightened, his voice low. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Elias. Not anymore." The words were a lifeline, but Elias couldn't grab it, not yet. He was still an alpha, still fighting to define himself in a world that had taken everything. But Julian's belief in him, his unwavering care, was chipping away at the walls Elias had built. The night of the fight arrived, the air thick with anticipation. The arena was a warehouse on the edge of the city, packed with a bloodthirsty crowd. Julian's fighter, a young alpha named Malik, was their best shot. But Victor's champion was a beast, a former MMA star with a reputation for brutality. Elias stayed in the shadows, his role to watch for traps, But his eyes kept drifting to Julian, who stood ringside, his presence a beacon. The fight was savage, each blow echoing through the warehouse. Malik held his own, but Victor's men were circling, waiting for their moment. Elias spotted a glint of metal in the crowd, a knife aimed at Julian. He moved without thinking, shoving Julian out of the way as the blade grazed his side. Pain flared, but he stayed upright, adrenaline drowning it out. Julian's eyes were wild as he grabbed Elias, pulling him to safety. "You idiot," he hissed, his hands checking the wound. "Why do you keep doing this?" "Because you do the same," Elias shot back, breathless. The fight ended with Malik's victory, but the cost was high. Victor's men fled, but the damage was done. Julian's empire was battered, and Elias was bleeding. Back at the penthouse, Julian stitched him up, his hands shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "You're going to get yourself killed," he said, his voice breaking. Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe, but I'm not letting you go down alone." Julian's hands stilled, his eyes searching Elias's. "Why?" Elias swallowed, the truth clawing its way out. "Because I love you too." The admission was a release, a weight lifted after years of denial. Julian's breath caught, and for a moment, they were just two men, stripped of titles and grudges. Julian leaned in, his forehead resting against Elias's, their breaths mingling. "You're going to be the death of me," Julian whispered, but there was a smile in his voice. Elias laughed, the sound raw but real. "Likewise." They didn't kiss, not yet. The moment was too fragile, too new. But the air between them was different, charged with a promise neither could ignore. They were no longer just rivals, no longer just partners. They were something more, something neither had the words for. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, Elias felt like they could win not just against Victor, but against the walls they'd built around themselves. He was still an alpha, still fighting, but now he was fighting for something bigger than pride. He was fighting for Julian. The confession changed everything, yet nothing. Elias and Julian moved through their days with a new rhythm, their partnership seamless but laced with an unspoken tension. They didn't talk about love. It was too raw, too dangerous in a world where Victor was still a threat. But it was there, in every glance, every touch, every moment they stole in the chaos. Victor's empire was crumbling, but he was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. Elias and Julian worked tirelessly, fortifying their defenses, rallying their fighters, and preparing for the final blow. Elias's condition worsened, the pain sharper, the episodes more frequent. He hid it as best he could, but Julian's eyes saw everything. "You need to see a doctor," Julian said one morning, his voice firm. "I'm fine," Elias lied, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Julian stepped close, his voice low. "You're not. And I'm not losing you." The words were a vow, and Elias felt them in his bones. He nodded, relenting, and Julian arranged the appointment. The doctor's verdict was grim. Elias needed surgery soon, or he wouldn't survive the year. The news was a gut punch, but Julian's hand on his shoulder kept him grounded. "We'll get through this," Julian said. "Together." The surgery was scheduled, but the war with Victor wouldn't wait. They got word of his final playa, massive fight night, a spectacle to reclaim his dominance. It was a trap, but it was also their chance to end him. Elias insisted on being there, despite Julian's protests. "I'm not sitting this out," he said, his voice steady. "This is our fight." Julian's eyes softened, but his jaw was tight. "If you go, you stay with me. No exceptions." The night was electric, the arena a sea of noise and chaos. Victor was there, his presence a dark cloud, his fighters ready to destroy. Julian's team was strong, but the stakes were higher than ever. Elias stayed at Julian's side, his role to watch, to protect. His heart pounded, his body screaming in protest. But he refused to back down. The fights were brutal, each one a test of will. Julian's fighters held their own, but Victor's men were relentless. their attacks laced with dirty tricks. Elias spotted a group of Victor's men moving toward the back, where Julian's supplies were stored. He grabbed Julian's arm, pulling him aside. "They're going for the stash," he said, his voice urgent. Julian nodded, signaling his men. But before they could act, Victor appeared, his smile cold. "You're done, Torres," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This ends tonight." Elias felt the familiar stab in his chest, sharper than ever, but he pushed it down, stepping forward. "You're talking to the wrong guy," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "This is our city." Victor laughed, but Julian stepped up, his presence a wall. "You're finished, Victor. Walk away, or we'll bury you." The standoff was tense, the crowd holding its breath. Then Victor's men moved, and chaos erupted. Elias fought through the pain, staying at Julian's side, their movements synchronized. They took down Victor's men one by one, their partnership a force of its own. But the strain was too much. Elias's vision blurred, his legs giving out. He collapsed, the world fading. When he woke, he was in a hospital bed, Julian at his side, his face pale but relieved. "You made it," Julian said, his voice thick. "Surgery went well?" Elias tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Julian handed him water, his hand lingering. "Victor's gone," Julian said. "We took him down. It's over." Elias nodded, the weight of it sinking in. They'd won, but the real victory was here, in this moment. He reached for Julian's hand, their fingers intertwining. "I'm not your Omega," he said, his voice weak but firm. Julian smiled, his eyes bright with something new hope. "I know. You're my equal. Always have been." They didn't need to say more. The road ahead was uncertain. Elias's recovery, Julian's empire, their future, but they faced it together. Two alphas, no longer rivals, bound by something stronger than pride or power. They were love, redemption, a second chance carved from the ashes of their past. As Elias drifted back to sleep, Julian's hand still in his, he felt the city's pulse beyond the window, steady and alive. They'd fought for it, for each other, and they'd won. Not just a city, but a homie in each other.